Our speaker today has a very distinguished resume. I think most of you are probably aware of that, but he's just excelled in a lot of areas. Warren Carson is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of South Carolina upstate. He has been involved in many activities in the academic world, political world, the civic world, and just the neighborhood world. And he's here today to talk about community, which is something that I think we're in dire need of reflecting on. So maybe he'll give us some food for thought. There's nothing wrong, though, with having a few laughs along the way, and I know he'll provide those. Warren Carson spent 34 years at the University of South Carolina upstate as a professor of English. He also taught African American studies and was chief diversity officer at the university, along with being senior associate vice chancellor for academic affairs. He holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of North Carolina. I'll add Chapel Hill, I shouldn't have to. But just for clarity's sake. And he holds a master's degree in Afro-American Studies from Atlanta University and a PhD from the University of South Carolina at Columbia. He's held numerous, he just has honors that are too long to mention. Be glad my voice is fading, because if it weren't, I might be tempted to talk on for just a minute and take time from him. But I think one thing I'd like to add is that Warren probably, from all I know about him, has probably excelled as a teacher above everything else. We have too many people today, I think, in the academic world who are not the teachers that we're entitled to. Wow. A lot of you are, don't get me wrong on that. But this is a man whose joy in life has been teaching. He's good at it, and what better legacy can someone leave than to prepare future generations for the world they have to face, the world they have to run, and to help them to understand that learning can be fun, that learning in itself is valuable. What we do with it probably is more valuable still, but we need a love for learning instilled in people. Too little of that's going on, in my opinion. I'll get off my soapbox and turn it over to Warren Carson. He's going to talk about, yeah, I see you on that. He's going to talk about personalities of the Eastside, entrepreneurs, educators of all things, everyday people. I give you Warren Carson.
Good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. It's been some day. I know everybody's kind of tired, and appreciate everybody coming out so late in the afternoon on such a hot day. But such a delight to see everybody here at Roseland Community Center, one of the places where I've grown up and grown out and grown old at, so but it's a delight to have you. I want to thank the Tryon History Museum for inviting me to give another talk on the East Side. We had a grand time last year, and looking forward to another grand time today. I want to talk a bit about personalities of the East Side, and I realize that this may be a little difficult for you to see, but we'll wing it and make it work. So personalities of the East Side: entrepreneurs, educators, ecclesiastics, and everyday people. Let me do a couple of caveats. Academics are not in the habit of sharing their work ahead of time, because we can never make up our minds what we're going to do. And so if we tell you we're going to do one thing, you tend to hold us to it, and we may want to add or subtract something, which is exactly what I did. I think when I was talking with Dick, I did not have the ecclesiastics in the presentation, but I mean, I really can't talk about the East Side without talking about the preachers and ministers, right, who have given so much to this community over the years. So that's one of the caveats. The other one is that I am not going to focus on people who left the East Side and went elsewhere. I mean, it's kind of natural for you to leave home, as it were, and go somewhere else and find another home and be there. That's all well and good, but I want to talk about the people who stayed, who built, and who helped sustain the East Side. You'll learn more about a few of them, a few of the representatives in just a bit. I'll focus mainly on people who were operative during the middle part to the latter part of the 20th century. That seems like a long, long time ago, but it really wasn't. These are people that I knew. Their lives were not extraordinary necessarily, except in the things that they accomplished as ordinary people living ordinary lives. So these will include the well-known, the lesser-known, the unknown, the notable, the noted, and the notorious. All right, Joe. Tell me which one it is. There we are. Last year's talk was titled Take a Walk on the East Side, and we looked at we took a tour, basically, a walking tour. We talked about the East Side from geographic points of view, its topography. We had a lot of hills on the East Side. We had a high road and a low road, so on and so forth. We talked about the demographics. We talked about the history of the East Side. We talked about its politics, its social life, and the culture that's associated with the East Side. Basically, we talked about the place. And as I shared with the people at the Tryon History Museum, while place is important in and of itself, especially in the South, you know, Southerners love our places, it's the people who give the place its life and resonance. Thus, this year I'm focusing on the personalities of the East Side and environs, I'll explain that in a minute, entrepreneurs, educators, ecclesiastics, and everyday people. Why environs? Although the East Side is the largest of the several African American communities or neighborhoods in Tryon, it's not the only one, but it's the one that is the magnet for all of the other smaller ones, some of which sort of cease to exist. Wilderness Road area used to be one such area. What we call the Hollow, you all call Depot Street, or Depot Street if you're from the north. It sort of ceased to exist, but all of those places, and then the west side of Howard Street as well was an African American community, all the way from Trade Street up to Lockhart Road, left to Lockhart, and right to Academy. All of those were African American homes in that area where Rogers Park is now. There were actually houses and buildings there that were businesses and so on and so forth. So that's the environs part. Wherever they happen to live, they either knew somebody, came from the East Side in the beginning, came to church on the East Side, came to a party on the East Side, or whatever it was. So that's the environs, and we want to talk about them as well as the people who live over on this side of town. I want to begin with the entrepreneurs, and I'm hoping that some of these pictures will show up sort of so you can see them. It's not a really good picture, but this is James Bryan Sr., and he's shown with his wife, Mrs. Eula Bryan. That better? Okay. So yes, James Bryan was a native of Rutherford County. He came to Tryon in the 30s by way of Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1930s. He actually met my aunt in Knoxville. He was there with his older sister. My aunt was there from Western North Carolina with her older brother. They met, and well, okay. They married and moved here. They were married for well over 60 years. Uncle James, and that's how I'm going to refer to him because that's what I called him, was a true entrepreneur in the classic sense. That means he did a little of this and a little of that, so long as it served the people and, made a little money as well. He was the proprietor and later the owner of Bryan's Store, which was a hub of the East Side. His motto was, "We doze but never close." I don't, the term general store doesn't really fit Bryan's Store because it was way more than a general store. Whatever you wanted or whatever you needed, and some of the stuff that you didn't want and definitely didn't need, you could get all day, every day. It was up to him 24/7, but my aunt would always put a stop to that. That was just not going to happen. So on that location, which was previously Lyle's store for those persons who lived earlier than, say, the 40s or 50s or what have you. He also ran a cafe, a pool room, and ran a trash route. He was also an award-winning Electrolux salesperson. Everybody who has an Electrolux vacuum cleaner for miles around, Uncle James sold it to him. And he had his own little presentation that they taught him, but he'd add his little sauce to it, He was actually a really comic kind of guy in a way, he'd keep you rolling. But how you could mimic people and so on and so forth. But he was going to sell you something. And he could fix it up so that you'd buy it. You'd think later, why did I let him talk me into buying all of these contraptions and things? He was also a church and a family man. He served the Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in numerous capacities. For several times he was the senior warden over there, and was actually instrumental when they moved the current chapel from down in the county. They dismantled that early chapel and brought it to the site and then remantled it, if that's a word, and then built onto it. So he was involved in that. He was the president of the Polk County NAACP during the time of school desegregation. One of the ones that participated in the lawsuit against the county school board, or the city school board and county school board, when these schools were being integrated. He's also the scoutmaster for Troop 151 Boy Scouts of America. Those are things that you would know and that you could probably read about were it written somewhere. What you would not know about, though, was how good and how helpful some of these people are, or all of the people that I'm going to talk about are or were to people of the community. My uncle extended credit like you would not believe. Now, he didn't have a bookkeeper or an accountant or anything. He kept his account on little strips that were torn off of cigarette cartons. And he would write what you got, what you owed, what you paid, so on and so on and so forth. And that's sometimes the stack would be this thick. And especially in the summertime when kids were working, especially when we were working here at Roseland, we would go up there and get our lunch. He had a little snack place in there where you could get hamburgers and all that kind of stuff. He said, "Don't go around hungry. Come on and get you a little something." So that was my uncle. So this is a picture of Edgar Hammond. Some of you may have heard of him. It's taken in front of the big house. Edgar has on his baseball uniform, and if you look very carefully on the side of that picture, you'll see the bats, the baseball bats. So Edgar was a Tryon native, one of 10 siblings. All those siblings were accomplished people, school teachers. A lot of them went to the military, business owners, so on and so forth. He was a graduate of Tryon Colored School, which was one of the iterations of the schools on the East Side. Of course, it started with the Good Shepherd Mission School, and then the Tryon Colored Industrial School, then the Tryon Colored School, then Edmund Embry. It's all, one evolution. He attended Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina. That's a historically black college there. He trained as a barber at the Harris Barber College. He was the owner of Hannon Barbershop, which was also a linchpin of the East Side. You didn't go there just to get a haircut. You went there to get all of the information that you didn't get elsewhere. On certain Saturdays, the Church of the Living God will be frying fish outside. You can get you a fish sandwich and a haircut, or a haircut and a fish sandwich, whichever one worked. I mean, just all kinds of things went on there. He continued as well his family business, the Hannon General Hauling business that was founded by his father, Deacon William Hannon, back around 1912. It still, as far as I know, holds the distinction of being the oldest family-owned business in Polk County, continuously run family business in Polk County. He was a baseball enthusiast. He was a member of the Tryon All-Stars, head usher and trustee at the Garrison Chapel Baptist Church. He was on time all the time. You didn't have to wait for Edgar. He was a member and secretary of the Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons from the Tryon City Lodge, number 518, which is the building's right directly across the street from the Garrison Chapel Baptist Church, and that church recently purchased that property to see if we could preserve it. Edgar was a generous supporter of many community activities, especially the Bloodmobile. It was always reported in the bulletin back in the day when they reached certain levels, and there was a big celebration when Edgar reached the 12-gallon mark. I don't know what that distinction was, but apparently it's a really important amount of blood to donate over the years. Edgar was highly opinionated. You didn't have to guess where he was coming from because he would sure tell you, and he did not suffer fools gladly. Sometimes, our personalities didn't always jive. I respected him as my elder, but sometimes I sure enough wanted to tell him where he could go. This is a picture of the Busyettes taken in 1956, and the person I want to talk about next is right here, Carrie Lee Massey. I'll tell you who the rest of the ladies are in just a bit. Miss Carrie Lee Massey, she was never married, and she was really proud to carry that miss, and she'd correct you in a heartbeat. Her roots were in Newberry, South Carolina, like a number of Tryon's black population. She too was a graduate of the Tryon Colored School. She and Edgar Hannon were in the same class, and they both went off to Benedict College, and he left and went to Harris Barber College. She left and went to New York City and trained as a beautician at the Almanella Beauty College. Came back to Tryon and was a beautician for many, many years. Her shop was on West Howard Street, the location of the entrance to Rogers Park now. That building housed a whole lot of things, not just a beauty shop. There was a moonlight grill upstairs and some sort of speakeasy downstairs, and whatever. She was also a caregiver in her later years. She was the only African American elected to serve on the Tryon City School Board. Those of you who are kind of newish to Tryon, there used to be two administrative units. There was Tryon, and then there was Polk County. And at some point, the state said that they would fund only one administrative unit. Tryon said, well, we'll just do our own. That didn't last long, so now it's all consolidated under one general administrative unit, and seems to be working quite well with good leadership. She was a chief mover and shaker and fundraiser here at Roseland Community Center. She was advisor to the NAACP Youth Council. She was active in the Edmund Embry PTA, even though she was not a parent. She basically raised her nephew, Steve Massey, who was one of the first African Americans to integrate over at Tryon High, along with Hawthorne Wingo and several other people who lived on that side of town. It was sort of a gradual kind of thing. She was active in the Garrison Chapel Baptist Church, especially with Woman's Day and the Busyettes. The Busyettes was an organization within the church, and they essentially were kind of the cooks and the decorators and the fundraisers for projects like new hymn books and things, but they also worked in the community, sometimes undercover. people were in desperate need for food or for a load of wood or something like that, the Busyettes would pool together and see if they couldn't address some of that. So this is Carrie Massey. This is her good friend, my Aunt Eula Bryan. This is their good friend, Mrs. Odessa Berry. This is Mrs. Annabelle Tucker, who's a school teacher, and I'll mention her in a minute. This person is Jane Logan Hannon, whose husband, she and her husband Osborne Hannon, lived at the corner of Academy Street and Lockhart Road in a house that's being refurbished at this point, or maybe they're going to tear it down and build something else. Mrs. Hattie Green, and the person that you can't see looking over everybody's shoulder, as she would want to do, because she was really short anyway, is Frances Lemon Wood, who is a character all to herself. She was from the Newberry area too, but she was a member, a really active member of the Order of Eastern Star, and she was charged with being over the juvenile division. And she called us juvenile. I was 60 years old, and she was still calling me one of her juveniles. All right, fine. So there were lots of entrepreneurs. My good friend and colleague and fellow laborer on the East Side, Dr. Joseph Fox, did a long presentation on entrepreneurs at one point, and he had established or discovered or uncovered more than 50 entrepreneurs working on the East Side at any given time. Of course, we didn't call them entrepreneurs then. I don't even think we knew the word, but we knew what they could do. So you can see here the whole gamut of things that they were into. Driving the taxis. They were caterers and handymen and nightclub cafe operators, laundresses, yardmen, housekeepers, etc., etc., etc. The point that I'm trying to make is that whatever people needed, people on the East Side, somebody was going to be talented enough to try to figure it out and find a way to supply it. And this has been a long-standing trait of people on the East Side. This is a picture of Anna Mooney Payne and James Payne. Mrs. Payne was an early businesswoman in Tryon City, which was how Tryon was referred to back in its early history. Her store was at the corner of Trade and West Howard in the same general area as the bagel shop and those other little businesses that are there. She is the grandmother and Mr. Payne, grandfather and namesake for James Payne, businessman and civic activist, grandson of Anna Mooney and James Payne. Mr. Payne, the grandfather, was a stonemason, so I've heard. Not a whole lot is known about him. This picture was sent to me by a schoolmate, their great-granddaughter, one of their great-granddaughters, Deborah Mack Newton, whose family moved from Tryon in the 60s or somewhere, so she's now a resident of New Haven, Connecticut. So she sent me that along with a long history of the Moonies and the Paynes and so on and so forth. But just to establish the fact that entrepreneurship has been around on the East Side and in Tryon for a long time. I chose not to say a whole lot about James because even though he was a really close friend of mine, everybody kind of knew who he was and what he did in the town of Tryon. And so I mean him no disrespect, and he would know that. But there are other people here besides just the ones that we may know. I want to give a shout out to the East Side Cooks. An important subdivision of the East Side entrepreneurs are the cooks and the caterers. The East Side was home to a number of in-demand cooks, many of whom worked in private homes, or they catered parties or other events, especially during the steeplechase, when Tryon was the steeplechase's center of gravity, so to speak. They also helped their churches raise money to meet the mortgage and several other things. So I kind of grouped the cooks with the church that they were associated with, and this is not an all-inclusive list. I know I left some people off, and I didn't really mean to. I just, was rolling with my brain, and sometimes it works fully, and sometimes not so much. Mrs. Olivia Green, Mr. Ralph Halfman, Mrs. Rena Brown, Mrs. Minnie Hines, Ms. Ida Rogers, Mrs. Gail Fox, all worked downstairs in the kitchen at St. Luke when they would have their dinners. Mrs. Louise Payton, Mrs. Hattie Green, Ms. Iona Fox, Mrs. Catherine Kennedy, Mrs. Esther Carson, that's my mom, Mrs. Odessa Berry, Mrs. Martha Dawkins, Mrs. Lois Young, Mrs. Lottie Barton, Mrs. Lily Talley, all worked downstairs in the kitchen at Garrison Chapel. And then you have what I'm calling institutional cooks. Mr. Arthur Young, who worked for years at Pinecrest, but later became the head of food services at St. Luke's Hospital. And he oversaw the barbecue pit at Labor Day in the back of Garrison Chapel when they would when they would roast a whole pig. And some of us, as long as they let us sit up, they usually ran us home about midnight. But we'd sit up and try to get all of the grown people's business. Mrs. Pearlie Booker, Mrs. Eva Russell. Mrs. Russell carried her own pots to cook in. She didn't fool with everybody else's cookware. Mrs. Bess Harrison, Mrs. Ethel McDowell, and Mrs. Sarah Shields. All of these worked in, Mrs. Shields was the school cook. Mrs. Harrison, this would be Bess Counts for some of you with that reference, and Ms. Ethel McDowell, they worked at the St. Luke Hospital when it was down on Carolina Drive. That was quite before Mr. Young took over. I had the opportunity when I was in high school to work with Mrs. Harrison and Mrs. McDowell downstairs in the hospital. And then on Saturdays, my Saturday job was up on Melrose Avenue, and Mrs. Lois Young and Mrs. Martha Dawkins both worked up at Spanish Courts. And they believed in making sure that the help was fed. So I had a wonderful breakfast from Miss Martha Dawkins, and Mrs. Lois Young would whisper to me later, "Come on by and get your lunch." It's a wonderful occasion, but yes, those are the Eastside cooks. And they could run the whole gamut. They could do, beef Wellington, the beef stew. They could do, fried chicken and the best in the country, salmon croquet, whatever it was. They could do it upright, or they could do it down low and soulfully. Can't leave off the waiters and the hostesses because they made the place run. So at St. Luke downstairs when they were having the church suppers, and Garrison Chapel and St. Luke have always stood side by side, well not always, but stood side by side for so many years, so they have to coordinate. So on the two Thursdays that they were having their dinners, we didn't have them at Garrison Chapel and vice versa. It was the kind of the way it worked, so they always had people coming to them. Up at Garrison Chapel, there were James Payne, Frank Brown, you would know him as Pick probably, Theodore, Ted King, James Kennedy, Hartford Douglas Jr., Haywood Hannon, John Brown, Roy Berry, Noni Robinson, who wasn't really a member at Garrison Chapel. He caught the bus back and forth between Spartanburg to work at Oak Hall, and apparently they paid him extremely well. Downstairs at St. Luke, you could have Mrs. Estelle Howard and Mrs. Dolly Hauber. Now these were sisters, but never two more unlike people you ever wanted to see in your life. Mrs. Estelle Howard was very, very prim and proper, and she would very elegantly seat you and so forth. And Miss Dolly, there was a live wire. She had an armful of bracelets, and she was kind of short, and she was hilarious. And she just run around and make sure you were seated and everything. And Miss Estelle would be. Up at Garrison, you had Ann Douglas, Barbara Qualls, and Carrie Massey, who kind of held down those jobs at that place. I want to talk about the educators. Educators tended to be more than just teachers. Helen Harris Hammond is the person that I want to begin with. She was a daughter and mother of school teachers, educated at North Carolina A&T State University and at Columbia University Teachers College. She taught the first and second grades at Edmund Emory High School, and let me stop right there. That was a huge responsibility. Edmund Emory had only 6 classrooms, and so each teacher was charged with teaching 2 classes. The way you moved from the first grade to the second grade was moved to the other side of the room. And I mean, I'm not talking about a handful of children, I'm talking about lots of children, and I'll try to show you that in just a moment. So, you know, imagine, it's hard enough teaching 1 grade. To have to teach 2 at the same time and run back and forth and make sure you, kept your own sanity if you could. After her retirement, Ms. Hannon taught the Good Shepherd Kindergarten until it closed in the spring of 1968. And 68 was the year that formal education in terms of schools, that was the end of it for the East Side. That year, Embry finally closed as the new high school opened and opened up more space at the Tryon elementary and middle school for those grades to move in. And then, of course, the kindergarten shut down as well. Ms. Hannon was an active member of the Good Shepherd Episcopal Church. Her father, Scotland Harris, was an early mover and shaker of education in this community, and also a very strong Episcopalian. She was not just a teacher, but a nation builder. She took her work very, very seriously. She was a stickler for rules. She could be severe, but she had a wonderful smile, but you didn't see it too often. It was almost impish in a way. She had a bold and beautiful signature, Mrs. H.H. Hannon. She put John Hancock to shame, trust me, when she whipped that pen out and write her name. Something about Miss Hannon that always stuck with me, and this is why I'm going to tell you about her being a nation builder. She always sought, along with all the rest of the teachers that I had, frankly, to try to find out what it was that you could do. Right? Everybody had a unique and special gift, a unique and special talent, and they tried their best to find what it was and to help you accentuate whatever that happened to be. Ms. Hannon had this little project when I was in the first and second grade. I have to admit that I only stayed in the first grade 1 week because I'd been schooled from the time I was 2 or 3 years old. So I was actually in the second grade. Anyway, she came up with this project where you contributed a nickel a week, right? And I don't know how many weeks that went on, maybe, half a year, perhaps, maybe a whole year, perhaps. But Mrs. Hannon, when we graduated, when that particular class graduated, delivered to each one of us who participated in her little project our savings, where she had calculated the interest over the years. It was a tidy little sum, for 1969 or whenever it was. It was a nice little sum, but I thought, my goodness, and this is what she was trying to teach us, this is how this works, people. You have to save some money every now and then and make it work for you. And so that was one of the things that she was quite willing to do. I don't know if you can see this. I do not like these pictures, but Mrs. Helen Hannon, this is her last kindergarten graduation at Roseland. You can see it right up here where I am now. She has just received her gift from the class, and the person who had given it to her has his back turned, but that's my younger brother, my much younger brother Todd, who had given her the gift and it turned around. So I know that he's here, that last class, and I saw Sherelle Booker, who was also in that class somewhere. There she is. All right, so. We got pictures, trust me. All right, so this is Mrs. Hannon and Mrs. Wilkins, and I'll talk about Mrs. Wilkins in a moment, with their classes at Edmund Emory from 1958. All of these people are first and second graders. All of these people are third and fourth. If you think those rooms weren't full, and if you think you weren't going to work, They had eyes all the way around their head, and we're not afraid. They were going to teach you something, even if they had to do some extraordinary measures. I won't mention those. The other educator that I want to make observations about is Mrs. Esther Wilkins Robinson. She was originally from Asheville, but she lived most of her adult life here in the area. She was first married to Fred Wilkins, and their home was down on 176 in Landrum. She subsequently moved to Tryon when she married Mr. John Robinson. She was educated at Winston-Salem State Teachers College. That was the historically black college. It's now Winston-Salem State University, a member of the Consolidated University of North Carolina. She also had a master's from A&T. She taught music, 3rd and 4th grade, directed the chorus, was a pianist at St. Luke's. She taught band such as it was, mostly just kind of individual instruments. I got stuck with the French horn. The worst instrument in the world to try to play. Anyway, she insisted on excellent deportment and good penmanship. She discovered that I could write reasonably well, and she made me practice. Those are the days when they had the cursive around the top of the building, and you had to go and practice, so on and so forth. She was friendly, she was outgoing, she loved a good party and a stiff scotch. I didn't know about the scotch until I was quite grown, and we were here at some kind of function at Roseland, and I was sitting with I always call her Miss Wilkins. It took me a while to get to the Robinson part. And so I got up, I said, "Can I bring anybody anything?" And Ms. Wilkins said, "Yes, stop by the bar and bring me a scotch." She said, "Don't you say anything." I said, "I was not going to say a word." She said, "How do you think I got through all of those years?" But like her colleague, Mrs. Hannon, she too was a nation builder. She was one of the ones who made you practice your penmanship. She made you sit up straight. She would sometimes make you put the book on top of your head so that you would hold your head up straight. She was especially rough with the women because the women needed to learn how to carry themselves appropriately. They need to learn how to walk in heels, something they still need to teach, by the way. That's another story for another day. I'm just saying. So there were a number of other notable Eastside educators. One was Professor Lewis W. Thompson, Jr., who was actually a former college history instructor. He taught at I knew I was going to forget it. I'll think about it in a minute. Miss Geraldine McKissick. If you've heard of Soul City, North Carolina, and Floyd McKissick, Geraldine McKissick was his older sister, and they were from Asheville. She taught here during the late 30s and 40s. She taught Nina Simone. I did not know Miss McKissick when she was here. I met her years later through her niece, who was a classmate of mine at Chapel Hill. And some kind of way we got on that conversation, and it started going around and around, and Mrs. Hines said, "Tryon? I didn't think there was anybody left in Tryon." So, anyway, we had a really interesting kind of exchange about that. Also, Buford and Esther Ledbetter Sanders were teachers there. Coach A.C. Bobbitt, who coached the championship team in 1957 from Edmund Embry. There were other teachers who were from Tryon in the community, and you knew they were teachers. They didn't necessarily teach here in town. Mrs. Ruth King Porter taught in Spartanburg for years and years and years and years. She was still teaching there when I started teaching in Spartanburg. And so we had wonderful conversations. I actually knew some of her colleagues, and so on and so forth. Miss Wessie Jackson taught out in the county. Mrs. Annabelle Tucker actually taught in several places throughout the county, but she taught the kindergarten when I first started. The year that I started, though, Miss Tucker got sick and passed away, and Mr. Thompson, Professor Lewis W. Thompson, Jr., took over those kindergarten classes. Now, I bet I'd be willing to wager I'm one of very few people who ever had a man as a kindergarten teacher. Professor Thompson was an interesting guy. He was an albino, and as with many, or most I should say, albinos, he had terrible eyesight. He couldn't see a foot in front of him. But never a smarter person have I ever seen in my life. He could do just about everything. He was an entrepreneur too. He sold Mason goods, shoes, and Raleigh products, you name it, he could do it. Another teacher in the area was actually a Tryonite, Mrs. Ophelia Carson Gray, of the Lynn Carson family that Carson Street is named for. Taught here briefly, but she went back to Charlotte. She had finished school at J.C. Smith, and she went back to Charlotte where she married and taught there for well over 40 years. There were several remarkable school principals. Herman Booty Green, who was the principal in the early to mid 50s, who had a magnificent musical background and had a really great male course of high school students, and the tale is that they sang all over town for various things. R.L. Webster was the principal when I was going to Emory. He left and went to work for the state, and I actually reconnected with him when I was a student at Chapel Hill. I ran into somebody who was a friend of Mr. Webster's and said something about meeting somebody from Tryon. Mr. Webster said, well, who is he? He said, I used to be the principal in Tryon, and so on and so forth. So, long story short, it's a small world. And then the last principal over at Edmond Emory was Cedric Jones, who had to preside over, the closure of the school and moving the seniors and people who had such an affinity for Emory over to Tryon High. Let me say a word about the ecclesiastics. These are ministers and pastors who are central to the life on the East Side. Again, mid to late 20th century. Reverend Charles Roman, who was at the St. Luke CME Church, was originally from West Virginia, graduated from West Virginia State College, which up until several years ago was an HBCU. It's now a majority white institution. It's a kind of interesting turn of events. But Reverend Roman was also the president of the NAACP here. He was not necessarily a compromiser. You didn't have to guess where he was coming from either, because he would certainly tell you so. Reverend Harold Cox was at the Garrison Chapel Baptist Church probably when I was a teenager. He was there, I know, when I graduated school. Reverend Cox was the first African-American pastor to deliver the baccalaureate address for the graduating class. Now, Reverend Cox was also a social activist. He led protests when they opened the Northwestern Bank down on Trade Street because they were not hiring African Americans. I cannot tell you the number of people that he got jobs for. One or two of them still have those jobs, by the way. Anyway, Reverend Charles Marion Carson, he was the brother of Ophelia Carson Gray that I mentioned a bit ago, of the Lynn Carson family over on Carson Street. He was one of the founders of the Polk County branch of the NAACP, and it was founded back in 1942, 1943 over a case of police brutality that occurred on West Howard Street at the location that I mentioned that housed Carrie Massey's shop and another club. And so that organization came in as one of the earliest branches of the North Carolina Association of NAACP branches. And so he's really a significant person. He and Mr. Lewis Thompson, they were the kind of movers and shakers. Reverend Commodore Rice, who never really pastored a church, he owned a little store. I guess you can call it a store. It's kind of a really small building, and you let down the sides of it, and you could go buy stuff on your way to school or on your way home from school or what have you. Reverend Mary Kate Wayman, who is associated with the St. Luke CME Church, and we know her as being the mother of Nina Simone, but her particular accomplishment, is being kind of the only female ordained minister on the East Side at that given time. The Methodists were kind of, far ahead of everybody else in ordaining women. Reverend Paul Smith of the Good Shepherd Episcopal Church, he was probably the only white person on the East Side on Sunday morning. But he ran that little church over there for many, many years. Really good, kind man, worked with everybody extremely well. And I've also listed Reverend J.W. Johnson, not so much for any major contribution that he made, but when Reverend Johnson left Tryon, he was also the pastor of Garrison Chapel, I mentioned that, but he taught high school English. And when he took another church in South Carolina, moved back to South Carolina, that's where he was from, that was kind of the last of the school teachers who lived and worked in the community. And it'll take me another whole presentation to tell you what effect that had on the numbers of black students who were yet to come and those who had struggled through while integration was going on. This is a picture of Reverend Roman. He also hung out at Bryan's store and got criticized mightily from the purists. Why are you over there with the Republicans and senators? He said, well, where else would you want me to be? I am a preacher, So, everyday people, and you're going to have to roll with me on this. I know you can't see it, but let's have just a little bit of fun. I don't know what made me think of this, but I was trying to think of some people that I could talk about. But I want to say that, it takes all kind of people to make up a community. So what this first line says is, a warp and a wolf, a fine fabric doth make. Sounds like it ought to come from Shakespeare, right? It didn't. Warren Shakespeare, But I'm saying that the community is all of us, right? And it takes all kinds to make up things. So we had a plethora of nicknames, and I'll just run them for you. 2 Plookies and 2 Dads, a Dinky and a Pinky, a Clip Ear and a Brokefoot, 2 pairs of brothers called Bruh and June, at least 3 more bruhs, 2 brothers, and a bruh baby, a big mom, a little bit, and a baby man, 3 or 4 rabbits, a tapin, 2 or 3 ducks, a muley, a beaver, a cub, and a mole, a poochie, a pookum, and a pork chop, pronounced pork chop, a June bug and a doodle bug, 2 cats, spelled with a C, 2 cats, spelled with a K, and a kitty. We are not done. A toots, a tootsie, and a tootie, a bunt and a bonehead, a huck and a buck, a caveman, 2 peewees and a slim, a long head, a red, and a scaramouche. I have no idea what that is. A Jew baby, a do baby, and a juju. A Jack Banner and a Bo Pondy, a Nit, a Nat, and a Ned, a Bolo, a Bo, a Big Dab, and a Dub, a Pie Face, and a Frog Eye. Now you have to be really careful about nicknames because they're intensely personal. And people will get you told. You don't walk up to say, walk up to somebody and say, let me find one, let me find a good one. Hey, Mr. Jew Baby. You get put in your place real quickly. Some didn't matter. Some were diminutive names of, their real name, like Nat or Nathaniel. It's just interesting. But these were real flesh and blood people who had real complicated personalities and lives. Let me find one in particular or 2, and then we'll close it in for a minute. Junebug. His name, as he would tell you, was Oliver McCarroll Jr. He was from South Carolina. And I used to think that I always thought they were brothers, but they were actually cousins, as I learned later. There were three of those guys: Spence, Junebug, and Pee-wee. Pee-wee's name was Perry. They lived with their aunt, Mrs. Nancy Few, Mrs. Nancy D. Few, and they were apparently her brother's children, is what I learned much later. But Junebug, I really didn't know him that well until I was grown and came back to Tryon, and he was still around. By that time, he was suffering from a life of rough living, I should say. Given to too much fortified wine, perhaps. But in his early days, Junebug was a strikingly good-looking dude, nice hair, and he was smart as a whip. And you talk about somebody that had a beautiful penmanship. That was him. And I was just amazed at how much he knew. There were big books and stuff all over his house, up under the bed, and I mean he could tell you anything. So, and you always can't judge somebody by what their outside appearance might be. Just for the sake of another one, let's see, Clip Ear. I didn't know the man had another name until he died. His name was Mac Gullet. He lived with the Miller family for the longest kind of time until Henry Miller, Mr. Henry Miller, who worked at the ABC store, passed away, and Mac moved up to live with Bunt and Ethel McDowell. And so I thought, who in the world is Mac Gullet? And my mother said, Clip Ear. And I thought, Clip Ear, why do they call him that? Well, he had gotten in a razor fight somewhere back in his early, and somebody had sliced the bottom portion of his ear off. So it made sense, Clip Ear. I mean, you had all kinds of things. So the two pairs of brothers called Bro and June, these would be Bro and June Whitmire, who grew up over on Lockhart Road, and Bro and June Payne. Alfred Payne's earlier name was June. And so you got all kinds of things going on here. A big mom was Mrs. Iona Fox. That's what her grandchildren and everybody else called her that hung out in that house. Her granddaughter was Little Bit, but the mother, you did not call her Little Mom. You called her Miss Catherine. Right? So I was grown, and Miss Catherine tried to get me to just call me Cat. I could not do it. I could not fix my mouth to call her Cat to save myself. The miss just kept on. I mean, that's who she was all those years. So in any event, those are some of the people that make up what we know as the East Side. Let me just say quickly before I turn it back over to Dick, that there were other people who owned stores in the East Side. Mr. Mount King had a store for a long time. It ultimately became a place called the Blue Door. It was right at the corner of Spruce Street and Markham Road. And it turned into a place where people actually lived, but it was a store at first. Mr. Furman Miller also had a store. I talked about Reverend C.D. Rice's little store, and Mr. John Wayman had something like a store at one time as well. Mr. Wayman could, come up with some real things to do as well. I mean, and talk about giving people what they wanted. Let me back up to Edgar Hannon. He also gave free haircuts, particularly when it was time for kids to go to school. He hated the afro style when it came in. And that's when he and I locked horns, because I had an afro that would put the sisters to shame. But he took people to the fair, load their truck up and go down the road to the fair. Folk from the East Side went on Wednesday. I'm not going to say anything else. Miss Massey loved young people. She'd be down here at the center with us, and she'd dance us to death. We'd be, trying to come up for air, and Cat would still be dancing. Let's see. Okay, I think those are the things that I wanted to say today. That concludes the formal part of my presentation. I hope you get a little bit of the flavor. We don't have a real time to do a deep dive into, everybody's life on the East Side. But when I tell you that it is a wonderful place to be from, it is a wonderful place to embrace. I don't know of another place that I would rather be most times than right here at home in my briar patch, the East Side. David.
Priceless, Warren, just priceless. Any questions for Dr. Carson?
I've got a
Dr.
comment.
McCall.
Warren, you mentioned the Moonlight Grill, which was right there on the corner across. Right,
From the fire department, yeah.
Yeah, right there, Well, I have a picture of myself at the Moonlight Grill.
Oh, you're going to tell on yourself. Go ahead.
I was a baby, and the lady taking care of me took me to the Moonlight Grill.
All right.
There's a picture somewhere of me sitting on the bar at the Moonlight Grill.
That's a good one.
My first bar in my life.
Did that start you on a path of some sort? Yeah, okay. Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Mason Lodge?
Well, yes, the Masonic Hall, we sit there and watch that place being built, the iteration that's there now. But the fraternal orders have been part of the Tryon community since about 1912, when the Prince Hall group was founded. Shortly after that, then you had the Knights of Pythias. You also had the Elks Club, the Improved, Benevolent, Protective Order of the Elks of the World. I have to remember what all those letters stand for. Yeah, the Court of Calanth, Eastern Star, all of those. So yes, all of those were active in Tryon during the 20th century at least. Some of the people grew older, and once they started dying off, there weren't a lot of young people that they had been able to entice to join those orders. The last group to occupy that building were the Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons, and the Tryon City Chapter 518 closed down because they didn't have enough members to sustain their charter. You have to have 7. So I think the 3 oldest ones who are still living are Bill Fox, that's Joseph's father, George
95.
Pick Brown, who lives over on Tuckaway Lane, and George Fant, who's been ill for some time. So yeah, we purchased that building at Garrison Chapel just to see if we couldn't save it and dedicate it to some kind of future community use while embracing our past at the same time.
Warren, I've been wondering if Rowan June, Whitmire, and Buck Waddell, are they still with us? I played with them.
No, they're all passed away, yeah. You did say Buck, right? Yeah. Oh, we had 2 Bucks. I forgot about Buck Waddell until you mentioned it. The Buck I was talking about was Cunningham. All right, I'm going to change my presentation. Yeah, but his name was Emmanuel. Yeah. But he died some years ago. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the school, the summer school that was at Good Shepherd that Burl Day had.
That was the after-school program.
Yeah. How long did that go?
Well, it went off and on. It sort of was revived by Burl when she moved back down here. It operated here at Roseland for a long time. There were several of us who worked here in the afternoons. When the schools first integrated, we were, people who were struggling were connected with retired teachers and other people. The Congregational church really supplied a lot of tutors and what have you, but we continued that. I and Janice Nesbitt Lawrence and Helen Cunningham tutored here in the afternoons for a long, long time. And then there was a summer programs where a whole lot of stuff went on. Calvin Suber was one of our last lifeguards, I think. That was a long time ago. Mrs. Littlejohn?
When you were talking about the stores that used to be here, there's a man named Paul Carson.
On the west side, yeah, right up there. Yes, you're quite right. And I told you I met his niece is actually a good friend of mine. Yeah, I met her, she was teaching at Howard. It's amazing, sometimes you don't have to go anywhere. You just stand still and meet people that you can connect with. And so, yes, Mr. Paul did have a little store down there under the house where he lived. If you go past the fire station on West Howard, it's the largest house that's set over on that side, and he was downstairs. Thank you, Maureen. Yeah.
Warren, as I remember, Edmund Embry had a football team, and it was like 7-man football, wasn't it? 7 or 8?
Something like that.
Something like that. We had 11 men, but the group was so small that they had like a 7-man football team. And I think they played at Auburn Field like on Thursday afternoons or something like that. I'd go out and watch those games.
Yeah, that was still with Mr. Bobbitt.
Yeah, that was something to see.
He was a piece of work.
Yeah.
Yes.
Warren, mine is not a question, it's a statement.
Okay.
I want to tell you how much I appreciate your focus and emphasis on the people like you who grew up here, you came back here, the people in this community made the community and either left and came back or never left here, and I appreciate that. I think they're our real heroes.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Thank
We're on Peak Street, right?
Peak, yes.
Yeah, and what
Yeah.
peak was that this is named for? Do you know?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, except that right directly across the street, the property belonged to Rufus Peak. So, it stands to reason that, it's part of that family, I know.
Yeah.
So there was Ralph and Rufus and Christine and Joe and all those other guys.
Yeah, and Kate, well, you're much too young, but.
No, I remember Mrs. Peak.
Remember Kate?
Oh, yeah.
She lived to be 106 years old. My mother said 108.
Yeah. Well, she could walk to town and I could, barely get across the street. She was something else. Anyone else? Thank you. You've been wonderful. I appreciate it.
Thank you again. I can't say too much about future presentations except stay tuned. I have a lot of good prospects for the remainder of the year. And one of them will be speaking on September 26th, Wanda, am I right? As part of our 10th anniversary celebration of the museum. And we may be able to get one in the meantime, so watch the Daily Bulletin. I want to thank the Tryon County Community Foundation for helping make this possible. And again, Warren Carson, as always, this is at least his 3rd Tales of Tryon. Could be, well, that's not too many. You made reference to another one you'd like to make here with today. Whether you remember it or not, I'm going to. So, is there anything else that I'm overlooking? Okay then, stay tuned.
Let me say just one word. This is sort of an interesting kickoff to a really busy 3 weeks for the Roseland Community Center. Saturday we are celebrating Juneteenth, which also is our official kickoff for our summer program. It's called RISE, the Roseland Institute for Summer Enrichment, that will run through July the 5th. So it's just really an extraordinary busy period for us. I'm going to say my niece who directs the summer program, stand up, sweetheart, and let everybody see you. They call her Miss T. I don't. But yeah, if you want to come out and help us celebrate some more, please do. Thank you.
Thank you. That was something I had meant to ask you about. It almost took it upon myself to say something, but it's better coming from you. You know what you're talking about. Okay then, thanks again. We appreciate everybody's support.